So you're there in 2 Kings chapter 9, and we are continuing our study through the kings, going through the northern kingdom of Israel. And just to recap, basically, when Solomon died, the kingdom was split. So you had the northern kingdom where Jeroboam, the son of Nebat, took over. Then you had the southern kingdom where Rehoboam, the son of Solomon, took over. And so just to give you a recap, and Brother Anthony's working on a chart, which is looking good. We're just tweaking it, trying to see if we can make it look just the best as possible as far as how you're seeing how they cross over and all that stuff. But we have Jeroboam reigning for 22 years. Then Nadab, his son, reigns for 2 years. Baasha ends up killing Nadab and all the house of Jeroboam. He reigns for 24 years. Then his son Elah only reigns for 2 years because the same thing happens to his house. And then you have Zimri who does that. He only reigns for 7 days. He burns the whole city on top of him. And then Omri, the captain of the host, takes over, reigns for 12 years. Then Ahab, his son, reigns for 22 years. Ahaziah, Ahab's son, reigns for 2 years. Then Jehoram, which is actually still Ahab's son, which is Jehoram and Ahaziah are brothers. Jehoram takes over and reigns for 12 years. And then this is where Jehu comes in. So Jehu is going to take out the whole house of Ahab. And he's going to reign for 28 years. So we're in the King Jehu. And this is a fun story dealing with Jehu. He's actually one of the only kings that's semi-good. Okay, I say semi because he's pretty good, but then he still clings on to certain sins and doesn't follow the Lord in all his ways. But he's close. He's like one of those kings that you're like, I like this guy, but he's still not like a Hezekiah or a Josiah or something like that. But the first thing I want you to see is that the first thing we see in this chapter is where Elisha sends a prophet to go anoint Jehu in order to do this errand, as it says here. And so God is anointing Jehu to carry out his will as far as how Ahab's whole house is going to be taken out. Now, Ahab's dead, okay? So just so you know, like Ahab died a while back, in the story, but we're talking about all of his lineage. So in this story with Jehu, we're going to deal with the fact that all of Ahab's house is going to be completely gone, at least in the northern kingdom, okay? So in verse 1 there of 2 Kings, it says, And Elisha, the prophet, called one of the children of the prophets and said unto him, Gird up thy loins, and take this box of oil in thine hand, and go to Ramoth-Gilead. And when thou comest thither, look out there Jehu the son of Jehoshaphat, the son of Nimshi, and go in, and make him arise up from among his brethren, and carry him to an inner chamber. Then take the box of oil, and pour it on his head, and say, Thus saith the Lord, I have anointed thee king over Israel. Then open the door, and flee, and tarry not. So the young man, even the young man the prophet, went to Ramoth-Gilead. Actually, when you're reading through the book of 2 Kings, you see the sons of the prophets. It's just an interesting thing as far as like why they're called the sons of the prophets. This is obviously seminary, and it's a bunch of young guys that are getting into dormitories. I joke about that, but the school of the prophets is where that comes, the school of the prophets, not in the Bible, my friends. It's the sons of the prophets. And they had wives, by the way. When you read these stories, it's like one of the sons of the prophet's wife, goes up and they have children and all this stuff, and they make it sound like it's this bachelor party of these sons of the prophets. All I'd say is that it's very clear that this young man is a prophet. Okay, but what it's saying is basically he's a prophet, but his father was a prophet too. Okay, and so anyway, that's a whole nother sermon for another day. School of the prophets, dormitories. Anyway, that's another sermon for about like why you shouldn't go to Bible college. I don't know. Anyway, what we see here though that Elisha sends this other prophet to go anoint Jehu. But what's interesting about this is that God tells Elijah to anoint Jehu. Go back to 1 Kings chapter 19. 1 Kings chapter 19. So 1 Kings chapter 19 and verse 15. You say, well, how does this fit? Well, I'm going to give you some possibilities as far as what's going on here, but it's interesting. 1 Kings chapter 19, verse 15, it says, "And the Lord said unto him," and just to get the context, I didn't want to read up a whole bunch, but we're talking about Elijah. He's talking to Elijah. You can look at the context. "But the Lord said unto him, Go, return on thy way to the wilderness of Damascus, and when thou comest, anoint Hazael to be king over Syria, and Jehu the son of Nimshi shalt thou anoint to be king over Israel. And Elisha the son of Shaphat of Abel-Maholah shalt thou anoint to be prophet in thy room. And it shall come to pass that him that escapeth the sword of Hazael shall Jehu slay, and him that escapeth from the sword of Jehu shall Elisha slay." So it's interesting, right? Because Elijah's dead at this point in 2 Kings chapter 9, right? He died. Well, he went up in the whirlwind, right, in the chariot. So whether he was translated like Enoch, we don't really know, but basically he went up to heaven, right? You say, well, what is this talking about? Why is it saying, like, God told him to do it, he did just not do what he was supposed to do? Well, I'll say this. It could be because Elisha has a double portion of Elijah's spirit, that it was fulfilled through Elisha, meaning that basically, and Elisha's not even the one that anointed him, right? He sent another prophet to do it for him, right? So this could be an aspect of, he tells Elijah to do it, but it'd be kind of like if someone told you to do something and then you had someone say, "Hey, listen, I need you to go do this for me," you still got it done, right? Does that make sense? Like, you don't physically have to do it yourself in order to do it, right? And this happens a lot with delegating work. And if you're, like a boss in a business or whatever, you're doing your job. It doesn't mean you don't do anything, right? And so it could be that, or it could be this. And I'm going to go probably more so with this one, that Elijah did anoint him. And then Elisha sent a prophet to anoint him again. You say, well, are they getting anointed twice? Well, this happens actually a lot when it comes to, like, anointing someone to be king, and then they reestablish it. Right? They did this with Saul. But I want to show you with David. David actually is anointed 3 different times. Okay? So go to 1 Samuel chapter 16. You say, this has nothing to do with Jehu. It kind of does, because you look at this passage, and you may say, well, didn't he say for Elijah to anoint him? And then over here, Elisha is the one that's sending somebody to anoint him. And you're like, is it a contradiction? No, I believe it's just both. Okay? And when you see Hazael's not even king yet, and he's talking to Elisha, and this is where Elisha's like weeping, because he's like, I know what's going to happen. Ben-Hadad's sick, and Hazael's coming down, seeing if Ben-Hadad's going to survive. And Elisha's like weeping because he knows, like, that Hazael's going to be king. And Hazael's like, "Why are you sad? What's going on?" And he's like, "Well, the Lord has shown me that you're going to be king." Well, it already says that Elijah is supposed to have anointed Hazael to be king. Okay, so it doesn't say that Elisha anoints him. He just says that the Lord has showed me that you're going to be king, right? So what I'm saying is that I believe that Elijah did all of this. Okay, it's just the fact that sometimes things can be done another time. And it's more so kind of like what we'll see with David, where he's anointed to be king, but he's not king for a little bit of time there, right? He's just a lad when he's anointed to be king, so he doesn't just start reigning that point, right? But in 1 Samuel chapter 16, verse 13, 1 Samuel chapter 16, verse 13, it says, "Then Samuel took the horn of oil and anointed him in the midst of his brethren, and the Spirit of the Lord came upon David from that day forward. So Samuel rose up and went to Ramah." So we know the story, right? This is before David and Goliath. So chapter 17 is where David, slays Goliath. And we know that there's still a lot of story left before he ends up actually reigning. Well, go to 2 Samuel chapter 2, because really David doesn't reign over Israel until in 2 Samuel. So the whole rest of 1 Samuel was David not being king, although he was already anointed. Okay? So I think that you kind of have this case where Elijah very well probably anointed Jehu earlier on, like when Ahab's still alive, right? Ahab's still alive, he anoints Jehu, and then later on is where he's actually going to be king and actually do what he's supposed to do. 2 Samuel chapter 2 and verse 4, it says, and the men of Judah came, and there they anointed David king over the house of Judah. And they told David, saying that the men of Jabesh-Gilead were they that buried Saul. Now, this is if you understand the story, basically, Ishbosheth, Saul's son, was trying to basically keep the kingdom. After Saul died and Jonathan and all that, Ishbosheth was trying to keep the kingdom, and basically there's this fight, and Abner is fighting against Joab, and there's that whole battle and that whole story there. But basically, David's just king over Judah at that point. Basically, Judah says, you're our king, not Ishbosheth, right? Well, then go to 2 Samuel chapter 5, because he's going to be anointed again. Okay, so notice that Samuel anoints him, the men of Judah anoint him, and then all of Israel is going to anoint him. Okay? So in 2 Samuel chapter 5 and verse 3, it says, so all the elders of Israel came to the king to Hebron, and King David made a league with them in Hebron before the Lord, and they anointed David king over Israel. So now we have all of Israel that's anointing him. So when it comes down to it, when it comes to this, well, did Elijah anoint him or was it Elisha? There's no contradiction. And actually, I've never heard anybody bring this up because they probably don't even know about this story. Just to be honest, this is kind of getting a little deep there. But I've never seen a list of contradictions. You're like, was it Elijah or Elisha that anointed? But it comes down to this, is that I think it's both. I think that Elijah did anoint Jehu. We just don't see it written. Does that make sense? We don't see where it's telling us the story where Elijah went and anointed him. We don't really see where he anointed Hazael. We don't see where he anointed Elisha. Right? We just see that if you're here when I'm taken up, then you'll know that you'll get that double portion of the Spirit. Right? And so all that to say is that this happens a lot where people are anointed more than once. And I think that's what's going on here. Is that Jehu was probably anointed when Ahab was still alive. And then now after, let's say it was at the very end of Ahab's life, you have, 2 years of Ahaziah reigning, and then you have 12 years of his son, of his other son, Jehoram reigning. And so you have 14 years that go by. So it's not that far-fetched that Jehu was alive, when Elijah was there. And obviously, he's being anointed to basically go do this errand, right? So going back to 2 Kings chapter 9 and verse 5, we also see that Jehu, I believe, is a captain of the host, one of the captains, okay? And like I said, when you're dealing with the captain of the host, what our modern vernacular for that would be like the general, like a general. Like we have a 5-star general, then you have like the 2 and 1-star general, right? And I look at the captain of the host as being, basically a general. And then you have the captain of all the host, So I believe that basically Jehu was pretty much like a general, kind of like Omri. Omri was the captain of the host, right? And they picked Omri to be king over Israel. And so Jehu is a man of war. He's not a weakling, right? He's not just a diplomat. He is a general, pretty much, the captain of the host. But he's with all his other captains. So notice in verse 5 there, it says, and when he came, behold, the captains of the host were sitting. And he said, I have an errand to thee, O captain. So notice that the prophet is saying that the captains of the host, plural, are sitting. And then he says, I have an errand for thee, O captain. Okay, so he's basically acknowledging that he's a captain. And it says, and Jehu said, unto which of all us? Okay, so it's very clear that I believe they're all captains sitting there. And he said, to thee, O captain. Verse 6, and he arose and went into the house, and he poured the oil on his head, and said unto him, thus saith the Lord God of Israel, I have anointed thee king over the people of the Lord, even over Israel. So we see that he's a captain of the host. He's sitting with his captains. They're all together here. So just kind of getting that picture. But this young man comes in. But then he tells them what he's going to do. And this could be also another reason why he's getting anointed again, right? Because you could see where Elijah comes in and says, and he anoints him and says, you're going to be king over Israel, and just kind of leaves, right? But this is not just that you're going to be king over Israel. You're going to go take out all of Ahab's house. Like, you're going to fulfill what God has been prophesying against the house of Ahab, okay? Now, whether Elijah said that to him, I don't, obviously we don't know. But this could be another reason why he's anointing him again, or basically saying, now's the time, right? I anointed you a while back, but now's the time to do it, And verse 7 there, it says, and thou shalt smite the house of Ahab thy master, that I may avenge the blood of my servants the prophets and the blood of the servants of all the servants of the Lord at the hand of Jezebel. Now, I want to stop there for a second, because remember when we did Ahab, that all this stuff was predicated on his wife pushing it, right? Jezebel's the one that had Naboth killed. Jezebel is the one that was killing all the prophets of the Lord. Right? It was all Jezebel. Now, that doesn't mean that Ahab was innocent, meaning like he has to take the blame for his wife and her actions. But notice that even in this, when it's talking about taking out Ahab's house, it's at the hand of Jezebel. So I just want to point that out, that Jezebel is really the main evil culprit when it comes to what's going on here. In verse 8 there, it says, "For the whole house of Ahab shall perish, and I will cut off from Ahab him that pisseth against the wall, and him that is shut up and left in Israel. And I will make the house of Ahab like the house of Jehoram the son of Nebat, and like the house of Baasha the son of Ahijah. And the dogs shall eat Jezebel in the portion of Jezreel, and there shall be none to bury her. And he opened the door and fled." So this young man did exactly what he's supposed to do, right? Go, anoint him, and flee. That's what Elisha tells him to do. So you can imagine, this is kind of a crazy story anyway, where this young man comes there and he says, "Hey, captain, I got an errand for you." He takes him into this inner room, pours oil on his head and says, "This is what you're supposed to do," and just hightails it out of there, right? Just see you later. Just runs away, right? And but all this comes true. And we see at the end of the chapter, spoiler alert, but we already read the chapter, Jezebel gets eaten, and the dogs eat her, and all that stuff that actually happens at the end of the chapter. But it's definitely interesting. Notice that it says in verse 9 that your house is going to be like Jeroboam the son of Nebat and like Baasha the son of Ahijah. And what happened to both those? Remember, that was just kind of repeating Jeroboam and then his son, and then they were all taken out. And then you had Baasha and his son Elah, and they were all taken out. And so it's this proverb, and he's basically saying, Ahab, you're going to be the same way. Your whole house is going to be taken out. And so it's basically this reset button. Do you see that? Where you have like Jeroboam, and then it's kind of like this nepotism, where it's this progenitors of this person, where it's this son, which you see in Judah, right? That is how it goes, right? You had the son of Solomon, the son of Rehoboam, the son of Abijam, and it keeps going down the line. Doesn't do that in Israel. It's just constantly like reset button. We're going to take out that whole house. Reset button. We're going to take out that whole house. And this is another reset button where Ahab's whole house is going to be completely annihilated. Now, what I love about the story, there's a lot of things I love about the story, but this is one that I love. His fellow captains, you could see the loyalty and the love they have for him. Okay? And when you ever read this, it just, it makes you laugh. All these stories make me laugh, right? It's like, it's supposed to be serious. Like Balaam and his ash, like it's supposed to be serious. It's not. It's funny. Okay, it's funny when it starts talking to him. But notice here in verse 11, then Jehu came forth to the servants of his Lord, and one said unto him, Is all well? Wherefore came this mad fellow to thee? And he said unto them, Ye know the man and his communication. Now, first of all, notice their regard for the prophets, right? And you say, well, how do they know that he's a prophet? Well, they wear rough garments, okay? So you see, like, Elijah would wear that leather girdle, and he was just this hairy man, and then they just, I don't have time to show you this, but there's other places where it talks about you're not to wear a rough garment to deceive that you're a prophet and all this other stuff. You say, why aren't you wearing a rough garment? I'm not a prophet, okay? I'm not Elijah or Elisha or anything like that. I'm not trying to portray myself as a prophet of the wilderness here. But all that to say is that they knew that this was one of those prophets. And notice their regard for it. They're like, what is this mad fellow? What is he saying to you, right? And I love this right here. And you say, well, it's obviously false what they're saying. But notice what it says. And they said, it is false. Tell us now. Notice the order of wording there, right? They didn't hear what he had to say. It was just automatic. Whatever you said, it's false. Because he probably came out of that room probably like, a little, gravity setting in of this situation, I'm being anointed to be king and conspire against the kingdom, right? And that he's got to do all this. And he's probably just taking it in. And they're like, is all well? They're probably wondering what's going on. This guy just came in and then he fled the scene, what's going on? And so you can imagine they're probably looking at him he's not in a cheerful mood maybe, I don't know. But they're just automatically, it's false. Whatever he said to you, it's not right. It's false. But notice this, how they switch their tune as soon as they hear what the news actually is. It says, and he said, Thus and thus spake he to me, saying, Thus saith the Lord, I have anointed thee king over Israel. Then they hasted and took every man his garment and put it under him on the top of the stairs and blew with trumpets, saying, Jehu is king. So notice how they're just like, it's false. Tell us now, And then they're like, he's king. Like they switched. You just automatically, when it was good news, they're like, oh yeah, what he said is right. But if it's bad, no. But what I see with this, and you say, well, they're being dumb, to basically just reject it out of hand. I see the friends. I see people that are just like, we got your back. Whatever he said, it's not true. It's not going to happen. Right? I kind of see like where Peter is looking at Jesus. Jesus is saying he's going to be betrayed of sinners and be crucified. And he's like, no, it's not going to happen to you. And I see that attitude because as a friend, someone that you love and care about, you're just like, no, it's not going to happen. I don't care what he has to say. I don't care what he said, but it's not going to happen. Then they're like, I'm going to be king. It's going to happen. It's just funny to me how they do that. But I see these captains, and notice that they're not fighting like, why aren't we king? They're like, of course you're king. They're like setting up like this throne, makeshift throne on the stairs for him, saying Jehu is king. So what I see is automatically I see Jehu as a great leader, someone that they respect and love. And so we see right off the bat that he's obviously a good choice here. People that want to follow him. And this doesn't end right here, where people want to follow Jehu. And so, what we see is that he's going to come and conspire against Joram. And I don't want to go through the whole chapter because there's other things that we need to hit in the next chapter. But this is a great chapter. Just in your spare time, read this over again and read the story of Jehu. But in verse 16, it says, So Jehu rode in a chariot and went to Jezreel. For Joram lay there, and Ahaziah, king of Judah, was come down to see Joram. So they're buddy-buddy. And then remember, Ahaziah is the name of Joram's brother, right? So, and you say, well, why do they have the same name? Because Athaliah is his mother, is Ahaziah's mother, okay? And Athaliah is the son of Ahab, or daughter. Athaliah is a girl. Athaliah is the daughter of Ahab, right? And so they're all related. See how that's intermingled, like the related, and just the house of Ahab. So they're related. It's like by marriage and by birth and all that stuff. So anyway, all I have to say is that we see that they're together in this story. In verse 17 it says, And there stood a watchman on the tower in Jezreel, and he spied the company of Jehu as he came, and said, I see a company. And Joram said, Take an horseman and send to meet them, and let him say, Is it peace? Okay, so basically, imagine what you're seeing. They're standing at Jezreel on this tower, and they see this company of horses and chariots just racing towards them. Okay? And at this point, I don't think they know who's coming, right? They don't know that it's Jehu. And so basically, they're sending out a rider to say, is it peace? Basically, like, are you coming to fight, or is this peace? Like, what's going on? And notice what happens here. In verse 18, it says, So there went one on horseback to meet him, and said, Thus saith the king, Is it peace? And Jehu said, What hast thou to do with peace? Turn thee behind me. And the watchman told, saying, The messenger came to them, but he cometh not again. Now this is funny because it's happened twice, okay? Basically what happens is this guy, rides out there and says, Is it peace? And he says, What do you have to do with peace? And basically like, no, there's no peace. That's basically what he's saying, get thee behind me. Basically, the messenger just started riding behind him, going with them, right? Notice that it happens again. So in verse 19, it says, Then he sent out a second on horseback, which came to them and said, Thus saith the king, Is it peace? And Jehu answered, What hast thou to do with peace? Turn thee behind me. And the watchman told, saying, He came even unto them, and cometh not again. And the driving is like the driving of Jehu, the son of Nimshi, for he driveth furiously. So I don't know if he could see that it was Jehu yet, or if he just knew that it's got to be Jehu, right? But notice that these two men ride out, and they're like, Is it peace? And it's like, there's no peace. Get behind me. And they just start riding with them, right? Now this is the true leader right here, meaning that I'm driving furiously. I'm going for doing what the Lord told me to do, and people are trying to come. These people that are against you are sending out these messengers, and you're just like, listen, what are you doing with them? Get behind me. And it's just this, I think about, I was talking to some of the guys when we were out soul winning about basically how people, we had those a Baptist church that came by and was knocking on our neighborhood's door, but they weren't going into the gospel. They were just basically handing out flyers. And I just think about how those people, if they had a good leader, a good church to go to, how they wouldn't just be handing out flyers. I just want to be like, listen, get thee behind me. Let's go do something for the Lord, right? Because they have the zeal, like this horseman, this guy on the horseman is not against the Lord. He's just doing what he's told, but he just needs a good leader. And so today we need some Jehus that have that leader mentality where people are saying, I want to follow that guy. Especially when you're going to a church, right? You don't want to go to a church where the pastor is someone just like, I don't really want to be like that guy. Right? Don't you want to be at a church, and listen, don't raise your hands, okay? Or don't say that like, well, I don't want to be like you. But to some extent, you should be saying, well, I respect the pastor enough to where I want to be like him in this aspect somewhere, right? As far as, whether it be Bible memorization, whether it be soul winning, whatever it is, the best, church to have is where the leader is someone you actually want to follow. Because if you don't have that, you're going to fall off the rails. It comes with soul winning. If you're saying, well, I want to go soul winning, but the pastor doesn't soul win, it's not going to work. They're going to find their Jehu somewhere that's driving furiously with soul winning, and they're going to get behind him. And so there's a lot to learn about Jehu and just the kind of mentality and how people are just quick to be like, no, I'm with this guy. And then we have the story, and I'm skipping over to chapter 10, but go to chapter 10 there, 2 Kings chapter 10, because in chapter 9 he takes out the king of Israel and the king of Judah. He takes out both Jehoram and Ahaziah. And chapter 10 is where he gets into where he takes out all the seed, like all the sons of Ahab, like the whole family, right? And in that story, we have the story about Jehonadab. And spoiler, but they're going to take out all the prophets of Baal too. So you can get the idea why Jehu's not that bad of a character. Right? He's fulfilling all these. Not only is he taking out Ahab, but he's just like, you know what, I'm going to take out all the prophets of Baal while we're at it. But Jehonadab is a man that, this is just a classic example of like, come with me and follow the Lord. And verse 15 there, verse 15, 2 Kings chapter 10, verse 15. Start getting that fly in the throat. I'm going to have to cut the sermon short there. Verse 15, it says, and when he was departed thence, he lighted on Jehonadab, the son of Rechab, coming to meet him. And he saluted him and said to him, is thine heart right as my heart is with thy heart? Say that 10 times fast. And Jehonadab answered, it is. If it be, give me thine hand. And he gave him his hand, and he took him up to him into the chariot. And he said, come with me and see my zeal for the Lord. So they made him ride in his chariot. Now you can think about this on a level of, well, Jesus is the Jehu, right? And we're the Jehonadab. And Jesus is basically saying, come with me and see my zeal for the Lord. You can definitely look at it on that level. But on the physical level, you think of Paul, follow me as I follow Christ. Mark them which walk so as you have us for an ensample. Follow us, in the Lord. And the idea of basically, come with me and see my zeal for the Lord. Get up in my chariot, ride with me. And it's the same thing that you see in the chapter before, where people are coming out and saying, is it peace? And they don't know what's going on. And he's saying, no, get behind me. Follow me. And so it's just this great leader that we see here. Go to 2 Corinthians chapter 9, because this reminds me, because he's saying, come with me and see my zeal for the Lord. How our zeal can provoke others to have zeal. Our work can provoke others to work. I think about this when it comes to Bible memorization. I never thought that I'd ever memorize a whole book of the Bible until I saw Pastor Anderson do it. And I'm sure he wasn't the first person to ever do that. Okay, I'm sure throughout history people have been memorizing books of the Bible. But his zeal to do that, you know what that did? It provoked me to do it. And others that, have saw other people memorize chapters and books, that zeal may have provoked others to do it. And so, notice in 2 Corinthians chapter 9 and verse 1, it says, "For as touching the ministering to the saints, it is superfluous for me to write to you. For I know the forwardness of your mind, for which I boast of you to them of Macedonia, that Achaia was ready a year ago, and your zeal hath provoked very many." So he's saying to them, listen, it's superfluous for me to write to you, meaning it's not needed, right? It's not needed for me to write unto you because we already know that your zeal has provoked very many. And I think of that with Jehu here, is that his zeal for the Lord is provoking all these people to be like, yeah, we need to get on board. And that's what we see throughout all these stories. We see these people that are coming up and riding up to him saying, "Is it peace?" And he's saying, "Get behind me." And they get behind him, right? Twice that happens. Then we'll see in chapter 10 where he's going to tell this city, "Listen, if you're on my side, do this." And they're like, "Yeah, we're going to do it." It's just like constantly where this man is basically just saying, "Listen, this is the way it needs to be." And they're just like, "Yeah, let's do it." And it's not just because he's saying it. It's because he's a man that people want to follow. And Jehu's not a perfect man. We're going to see that in the end, he doesn't really follow the Lord like he should. And I don't know whether he was saved or not, but I don't have anything to think that he wasn't saved. But we need to be thinking about that other people are looking at us. You say, "Well, I'm not the pastor of the church." You're still a leader in another way. Fathers, you're definitely leaders. Mothers, you're definitely leaders when it comes to your family. And your zeal to go to church, your zeal to go soul winning, your zeal to read the Bible, your zeal to memorize the Bible, your zeal to do what's right in some of the hardest situations that you can come to, they're going to see that. And what you need to do, especially with your children, is say, "Come with me and see my zeal for the Lord. Get up in my chariot. I'm going to ride. I'm going to drive. Just come with me." When you think about that with soul winning, when you go out soul winning and you're knocking doors and you have your silent partner, it's just like, "Come with me. You don't have to do anything. Just be with me. Just come with me as I give the gospel and see my zeal for the Lord." And we need to have these principles as far as how Jehu led people. Okay, so you say, "Well, I'm just a child." Do you have siblings? Do you have children that are around you that that are younger than you? Because in all those cases, there's someone looking up to you. Unless you're like Emma. Emma's probably got. No one's looking up to Emma because she's only 2 months old. But barring that, okay, meaning that everybody is looking up to you to some extent. Somebody is. Okay, so you don't have to be the leader of the church or anything like that. But going on in verse 22, we see where he actually kills Jehoram and Ahaziah. And verse 22, it says, "And it came to pass, when Jehoram saw Jehu, that he said, 'Is it peace, Jehu?' And he answered, 'What peace, so long as the whoredoms of thy mother Jezebel and her witchcrafts are so many?'" Yeah, there's no peace. So notice that Jehu, he's not just this, you may look at him at first and think, well, he's just a secular guy that's just a good leader, a good man of war and all that stuff. No, he doesn't like what's going on with Jezebel, and all these witchcrafts and all this stuff that's going on with her, right? Verse 23, "And Jehoram turned his hands and fled and said to Ahaziah, 'There is treachery, O Ahaziah.'" So I don't know, I just think of this story where he's like running out there and be like, "Is it peace? It's treachery, Ahaziah." And they start running back, like to the hills, and they start running away. So anyway, so he's obviously fleeing. And in verse 24 it says, "And Jehu drew a bow with his full strength and smote Jehoram between his arms, and the arrow went out at his heart, and he sunk down in his chariot." So if you imagine, he probably had armor on. I don't know if he had plate mail. Probably didn't have chain mail back then. But basically, through his arm, so it's basically where there'd be, a spot where there's no armor, and it went through his arm and went out his heart. Okay, so you say, well, is Jehu a good man of war? Well, that was pretty good, right? That he full strength. Now, those that never shoot a bow or anything like that, when you're doing a bow at full strength, that means it's probably pretty far away. that you're doing this, especially, and to hit that mark, and he's riding away, okay? So he's on a horse with chariot, riding away, and then he pulls this thing fully back and hits him through the heart. So obviously Jehu is a good man of war when it comes to that. But then also Ahaziah is taken out. So in verse 27 there, it says, "But when Ahaziah the king of Judah saw this, he fled by the way of the garden house, and Jehu followed after him and said, 'Smite him also in the chariot.' And they did so at the going up to Gur, which is by Ibleam, and he fled to Megiddo and died there. And his servants carried him in a chariot to Jerusalem and buried him in a sepulchre with his fathers in the city of David." So both of them die on the same day. And so Ahaziah, Jehoram, they're both taken out the same day. Now, here it looks like Jehu's servants went after him. So they all went in there, but he basically says, "You go smite him." And so they killed Ahaziah. So after that, he comes back to Jezreel. So remember, they're on the wall at Jezreel, and they have the watchmen there. So they kill them, and then then they're going into Jezreel, and this is where Jezebel is taken out. And it's interesting about Jezebel here. It says in verse 30, it says, "And when Jehu was come to Jezreel, Jezebel heard of it, and she painted her face and tired her head and looked out at a window." So this is where, I don't know, when it says painted her face, I mean, it could be talking about makeup, and it could be talking about, I don't know if it's Braveheart, straight up, blue face. When I think of painting your face, that's what I think about, okay? But I know that people have different things, and this is a side note when it comes to makeup. I don't think makeup's sinful, but, it's up to you what you want to do with that. Obviously, you shouldn't be painting your face to where people know that it's like it looks like you painted your face on. People go way too far with that type of stuff. And so, anyway, that's a side note. I'm not getting into those weeds right now. Have people clawing at me afterwards. But anyway, Jezebel painted her face. Just think about that. Anyway, and so in verse 31, it says, "And as Jehu entered in at the gate, she said, 'Had Zimri peace, who slew his master?'" So what's she saying here? Basically, Zimri, remember, conspired against Elah when he was drunken and all that stuff and ended up killing him. And then Zimri, the whole host was coming after him, and then he burned the house down on top of himself because he knew that he couldn't win the battle. So she's basically calling back to Omri and back to that situation with Zimri and saying, did Zimri have peace? Basically saying, you're going to go down like Zimri. And notice what he says here in verse 33. In verse 32. It says, "And he lifted up his face to the window and said, 'Who is on my side?' 'Who?' And there looked out to him 2 or 3 eunuchs." And notice how he's just like, "Who's on my side?" And people are coming out here, he's like, "Follow me." And then now he's like at the wall here, he says, "Who's on my side?" And these 2 or 3 eunuchs come out. And in verse 33 it says, "And he said, 'Throw her down.' So they threw her down, and some of her blood was sprinkled on the wall and on the horses, and he trode her underfoot." So think about this death that she has, right? She's thrown off a wall, and obviously she's hitting this wall as she's going down. That's pretty much the way you look at it, right? If there's blood sprinkled on there, it's because she's hitting things as she's going down. She comes down, and then Jehu literally runs her over with his horse. Now, that doesn't stop there, okay, because obviously she dies. But it says in verse 34, it says, "And when he was come in, he did eat and drink, and said, 'Go see now this cursed woman and bury her, for she is a king's daughter.'" Now think about this. He literally says, throw her down, rides her over with his horse, and then just goes in and starts eating dinner. You ever think about that? Like, he's just like, I'm going to go eat some dinner. It's been a long day. And as he's eating dinner, he's like, you know what? We need to probably bury her. And so, listen, if you can't find humor in the Bible, then, you need to lighten up a little bit. Obviously, this is an extreme thing. It's not like, obviously, she dies. But I laugh at it because she's such a wicked woman. Yeah, right? She killed prophets. She killed Naboth, the Jezreelite. And so she's a very wicked woman. She was trying to kill Elijah all the time and all this stuff. And so she's a very wicked woman with her sorceries and her witchcrafts and all that stuff. But I just think that's funny. He just trods her underfoot and be like, I'm going to go eat some dinner. And as he's eating, you're like, you know what? Maybe we're a little hard on him. Maybe we should eat. Maybe we should. And I don't think he was thinking this. But basically, then they go out there, and it says in verse 35, and they went to bury her, but they found no more of her than the skull and the feet and the palms of her hands. And it's going to tell you why. Wherefore they came again and told him. So this is kind of funny to me because he already knew this. Okay, it's kind of like, go out there and bury her, but he's like, they're going to come back and tell me that she's not there. Like, he already knew that this was going to happen. Because notice in verse 36 there, continuing on, it says, and he said, this is the word of the Lord, which he spake by his servant Elijah the Tishbite. His servant Elijah the Tishbite, saying, in the portion of Jezreel shall dogs eat the flesh of Jezebel, and the carcass of Jezebel shall be as dung upon the face of the field in the portion of Jezreel, so that they shall not say, this is Jezebel. Wow. So not only was she thrown off the wall, trodden underfoot, she was eaten by dogs, and her burial was going to be literally when the dogs go to the bathroom out in the field. You say, well, that's graphic. That's the Bible, okay? I didn't write it, but that's what happened to Jezebel. That's what God does to people that hate the Lord. And especially these reprobates and these sodomites that you're dealing with today, they love dung. Well, they're going to be dung upon the field, like Jezebel. And so, but a very wicked woman finally meets her demise, and Jehu's the one that executes her. And I just love how each story that we get into with Jehu, he's constantly calling out people like, are you on my side? Follow me. And they're just like, yep, we're with you. Throw her down. And so, I don't know, maybe they had a vendetta against her. Maybe they didn't like her. We didn't like her anyway. Throw her down. But Jehu also, in chapter 10, so basically what do you have in chapter 9? You have the fact that he's anointed king. He rides furiously after Jehoram and Ahaziah. He has both them killed. And then he comes into Jezreel and takes out Jezebel. Well, there's still a lot of the houses of Ahab that needs to be taken out. Those are obviously the top ones, right? Jezebel, and then her son there, Jehoram, and then Ahaziah, which is a relative. But in chapter 10 there, notice what it says. Verse 1, it says, and Ahab had 70 sons in Samaria. That's a lot of sons. 70, right? Now, I don't know if this is saying like sons like straight up, like you have a son, or if it's like sons like sons and grandchildren and all that stuff like going down the line. It could be, because just because it says son doesn't mean it's a direct son. It could be a grandson or whatever. But all that to say is that there's 70 of them in Samaria. And Jehu wrote letters and sent to Samaria unto the rulers of Jezreel, to the elders, and to them that brought up Ahab's children, saying, now, as soon as this letter cometh to you, seeing your master's sons are with you, and there are with you chariots and horses, a fenced city also in armor, look even out the best and meetest of your master's sons, and set him on his father's throne, and fight for your master's house. So notice what he's saying here. He's saying, listen, set up your king now and come out and fight. Right? That's what he says to them at first. He's like, get your best men and let's do this. And notice what they do, because and notice that it's like the Ahab's children, and it's talking to people that brought up Ahab's children. So you're talking about the people that took care of them, brought them up, knew them all their life. I want you to get that in your mind because of what happens next. Okay? So they're afraid because Jehu's just like, whoever you got, let's do this, bring it on. Then it says in verse 4, but they were exceedingly afraid and said, behold, 2 kings stood not before him. How then shall we stand? He's like, you took out Ahaziah and Jehoram in one day. How in the world are we going to fight against you? Notice, you keep reading there, it says in verse 5, it says, and he that was over the house, and he that was over the city, the elders also, and the bringers up of the children, sent to Jehu, saying, we are thy servants, and will do all that thou shalt bid us. We will not make any king. Do thou that which is good in thine eyes. So they're basically just saying, we're yours, whatever you want. Notice in verse 6, then he wrote a letter the second time to them, saying, If ye be mine, and if ye will hearken unto my voice, take ye the heads of the men your master's sons, and come to me to Jezreel by tomorrow this time. Now the king's sons, being 70 persons, were with the great men of the city, which brought them up. And I want you to keep noticing that. They brought them up. These are not just like, well, they were in the city, and they're like, here, you can have them. We're talking about the people that knew all these people, all the sons, that brought them up. And Jehu's like saying, listen, if you're for me then bring me their heads. Notice in verse 7. And it came to pass, when the letter came to them, that they took the king's sons and slew 70 persons and put their heads in baskets and sent them to Jezreel. So they did it. Verse 8, and there came a messenger and told him, saying, they have brought the heads of the king's sons, and he said, lay ye them in 2 heaps at the entering in of the gate until the morning. Now, this is very interesting. In verse 9 here, we're going to see that Jehu's not an idiot. Okay, he's actually very wise in what he does here and why he has them kill him. Okay? Notice what he says in verse 9. And it came to pass in the morning that he went out and stood and said to all the people, ye be righteous. Behold, I conspired against my master and slew him. But who slew all these? Notice how he's like, you're with me now, whether you like it or not. You see that? Like, he's basically saying, you're with me. You killed him too. You killed all his sons. So he's not an idiot. He knows what he's doing, because you can think about the fact that he maybe worry about, like, well, you conspired against the king and all of Israel is coming against them. No, all of Samaria was in on this. All the elders, everybody was in on it, and they all did it. And he's like, I killed these 2 kings, but who killed all these? So I just think that's interesting that he's not only a man of war, but he's very smart. He's very intelligent. And so you don't become this captain where people would want to follow you and be an idiot. Okay? He had a lot of intelligence. And so, but going on there, in verse 10 it says, know now that there shall fall unto the earth nothing of the word of the Lord, which the Lord spake concerning the house of Ahab, for the Lord had done that which he spake by his servant Elijah. So Jehu slew all that remained of the house of Ahab in Jezreel, and all his great men, and his kinfolks, and his priests, until he left him none remaining. Notice in verse 17 that he also goes into all of Samaria as well. So Jezreel, Samaria, all that stuff. It says in verse 17, it says, and when he came to Samaria, he slew all that remained unto Ahab in Samaria, till he had destroyed him, according to the saying of the Lord, which he spake to Elijah. Now, what we'll see later on when we get to the kings of Judah and all that stuff is Athaliah is still alive. And she actually reigns during Jehu's reign. She's like, well, Athaliah, well, that's another kingdom, okay? So he'd have to invade another kingdom to take out that. Does that make sense? But she ends up doing the work for the Lord. She ends up killing, spoiler, she ends up killing all of Ahaziah, her son's children. All the seed royal. So, except for Joash. They keep Joash away. And then Athaliah dies. So you know what happens there? They all die except for, one of the sons that goes down the line there. So Athaliah's gone. All that whole affinity with Ahab's gone because all their house is gone. So eventually it's all going to be completely wiped away at the end. So, but again, you're dealing with Samaria, which is in the northern kingdom. So he's not going to go down into Judah and start taking out all the rest down there. But in chapter 10 there, we also see this story. This is also a very interesting story, dealing with the prophets of Baal. So Jehu, this is after he, Jehonadab, the story with Jehonadab coming up in the chariot, because Jehonadab goes with them when they go into Samaria and take out the rest, but then he's also with them in the story of taking out the prophets of Baal. In verse 18, it says, and Jehu gathered all the people together and said unto them, Ahab served Baal a little, but Jehu shall serve him much. Okay? This is all an elaborate ruse. Right? This whole story, and I know I'm telling you before I read it, but he doesn't want to serve Baal. He's going to end up killing all of them. But what he does is he sets up this false narrative like, you know what? Ahab served Baal a little, but I'm going to serve him a lot. Right? You haven't seen nothing yet. And so that's what he does in verse 19 there. Throat's really dry for some reason today. Verse 19, it says, now therefore, Call unto me all the prophets of Baal, all his servants and all his priests. Let none be wanting, for I have a great sacrifice to do to Baal. Whosoever shall be wanting, he shall not live. But Jehu did it in subtlety, to the intent that he might destroy the worshipers of Baal. So notice that he's basically putting on this facade, this front, saying, hey, I want to worship Baal too. Get everybody. I don't want anybody to be missing, right? None be wanting. I want everybody here. This is going to be a big sacrifice. It's going to be huge, right? I can't do a Trump voice. But anyway, so in verse 20 there, it says, and Jehu said, proclaim a solemn assembly for Baal. And they proclaimed it. And Jehu said, through all Israel, and all the worshipers of Baal, or sent through all Israel, and all the worshipers of Baal came, so that there was not a man left that came not. So this is the narrator speaking. Okay, so we know that it is everybody. And they came into the house of Baal, and the house of Baal was full from one end to the other. And he said unto him that was over the vestry, bring forth vestments for all the worshipers of Baal. And he brought them forth vestments. So he's like, I got outfits for you. I got your special underwear, right? I got these special outfits for you to wear since you're prophets of Baal. So you can imagine he's building this thing up like, this is great. It's even better than Ahab because he just loves Baal and he wants to worship and all this stuff. So they think they're getting promoted in this act here. Notice in verse 23 it says, and Jehu went and Jehonadab, the son of Rechab, so now we see Jehonadab there with him, into the house of Baal and said unto the worshipers of Baal, search and look that there be here with you none of the servants of the Lord, but the worshipers of Baal only. So notice what he's doing here because he's setting up a trap. He's gonna destroy them all. But he's like, I want you to find out if there's any worshipers of the Lord here. I don't want any of them here. Right? If you find them, you make sure they leave. Okay, so he's basically wanting to make sure that everybody that's there is really a worshiper of Baal and not of the Lord. Okay, so notice how he's vetting this. But he's doing it subtly and kind of in the opposite direction, making it sound like, we don't want any of those losers here. Make sure none of those losers that worship the Lord are here, right? And notice in verse 24 it says, and when they went in to offer sacrifices and burnt offerings, Jehu appointed 80 men without and said, if any of the men whom I have brought into your hands escape, he that letteth him go, his life shall be for the life of him. So that's quite a charge. Basically saying you're going to die if you let anybody get out of here alive. Notice in verse 24, it says, and when they went in to offer, in verse 25, it says, and it came to pass, as soon as he had made an end of offering the burnt offering, that Jehu said to the guard and to the captain. So I want you to notice something, that he made sure they did this offering, and they were actually, right? He didn't just say, are you worshipers of Baal? You're dead. He basically set this whole thing up, and they're over there like worshiping Baal. I don't know if they're cutting themselves, whatever they do, And he's making sure, like you're caught in the act, right? It's like you're caught in the act, you're done, and kills them. And it says, and he said to the guard and to the captain, go in and slay them, let none come forth. And they smote them with the edge of the sword. And the guard and the captains cast them out and went to the city of the house of Baal. Notice this. And they brought forth the images out of the house of Baal and burned them. And they break down the image of Baal and break down the house of Baal and made it a draft house unto this day. You're like, what's a draft house? It's an outhouse. When Jesus said, that which goeth into the mouth and into the belly cometh out the draught, that's what it's talking about. And the Bible's very discreet when it talks about it, but it made it an outhouse. It's a toilet. That's what he made the house of Baal. So you can see why I kind of like Jehu, okay? For a lot of reasons, but, he does what the Lord says. He's a man that people want to follow, that are loyal to him, that love him. When someone comes in and he's kind of like his sad in countenance, he's like, what'd that person say? It's false. Tell me. Like, they're just automatically, whatever they said that's making you sad, it's not true. Right? And that mentality, that loyalty. And then people are following him in battle. They're literally coming up against him, and he's like, get behind me. And they're like, yeah, you're right. I'm going to follow you. And then he comes into the city. He says, who's on my side? Who? And then these eunuchs are like, I'm on your side. Throws her out. And then it's just constantly where the people of the city are like, yeah, we can't go against you. Whatever you say, we're your servants. And so he's just this great leader. And then he's like, by the way, I'm going to take out all the prophets of Baal, and just destroys them all and makes the house of Baal a dung house, a draft house, an outhouse. I think it's hilarious, right? Because that's where it belongs. You know, all these false gods, it's just a bunch of dung. So you can see, you know, why a lot of people like Jehu. But I got to give the bad news to you here. In chapter 10, verse 28, and obviously God rewards Jehu for the good things he does. But he's going to still have to suffer the consequences for not following him wholly. And in verse 28 it says, Thus Jehu destroyed Baal out of Israel. Howbeit from the sins of Jeroboam the son of Nebat, who made Israel to sin, Jehu departed not from after them, to wit, the golden calves that were in Bethel and that were in Dan. They just cannot let go of those golden calves. And it's just like constant through here. And so, like I said, when we did the sermon about Jeroboam the son of Nebat, that name keeps being brought up over and over and over and over. And that's the reason they're going to be completely annihilated, because they just wouldn't let it go. It doesn't matter. They'll do all this. What did Jehu do? He did all this that the Lord told him to do. Not only that, but he also took out the prophets of Baal. I don't remember where God explicitly told him to do that, but he did it anyway. Right? But he just cannot let go of that nation's religion. Right? Those golden calves. I don't know what it is about the calves, but they just like those calves. Anyway, in chapter 10, verse 30 there, it says, And the Lord said unto Jehu, Because thou hast done well in executing that which is right in mine eyes, and hast done unto the house of Ahab according to all that was in mine heart, thy children of the fourth generation shall sit on the throne of Israel. So he does reward them. He basically says, listen, to the fourth generation, your children will be sitting on the throne. And so it's not going to be like the house of Baasha and Jehoram, Jeroboam and all that stuff. But it says in verse 31, it says, But Jehu took not heed to walk in the law of the God of Israel with all his heart, for he departed not from the sins of Jeroboam, which made Israel to sin. In those days, so this is the punishment or the recompense for not following him wholly and for clinging on to the sins of Jeroboam. It says, In those days the Lord began to cut Israel short. And Hazael smote them in all the coast of Israel, from Jordan eastward, all the land of Gilead, the Gadites and the Reubenites and the Manassites, from Aroer, which is by the river Arnon, even Gilead and Bashan. So basically that's his punishment, right? So he basically says, because you did all this good stuff, I'm going to let your children to the fourth generation reign over Israel. But because you're doing the stuff with, you're clinging on to the sins of Jeroboam son of Nebat, you're going to have to deal with, Hazael and Syria and all that stuff. He's cutting you short, right? If he would have followed him wholly, I guarantee Hazael would not be a problem. That makes sense? And then it goes on in verse 34. Now the rest of the acts of Jehu and all that he did and all his might, are they not written in the book of the Chronicles of the kings of Israel? And Jehu slept with his fathers, and they buried him in Samaria, and Jehoahaz his son reigned in his stead. And the time that Jehu reigned over Israel and Samaria was 28 years. So he reigned a pretty good time. Actually, he's the longest reigning king at this point in the northern kingdom of Israel, right? Because Jeroboam reigned for 22 years. Then Baasha at that point was the highest because he reigned for 24 years. But even Ahab, he only reigned for 22 years, right? So we have 28 years that he's reigning here. And so, again, just to recap, Jeroboam reigns for 22 years, Nadab for 2 years. Baasha reigns for 24 years, Elah for 2 years. Zimri reigned for 7 days, 1 week, right? Omri reigns for 12 years, Ahab for 22 years, Ahaziah for 2 years, Jehoram for 12 years, and then they're completely, that whole house is cut off with Jehu. Jehu reigns for 28 years. And so from this point, just to kind of give you an idea of the timeline, it's been 126 years since Solomon died. Since the kingdom split, we're 126 years into that split of the kingdoms. And so Obviously, we still have some more. We're going to have, obviously the sons of Jehu, like God said, that are going to be sitting on the throne. And then it's going to go outside of that for a little bit. But really, there's not going to be that much more. I mean, we're going to have more kings to go into, but they're going to be cut off. Once you get to 2 Kings chapter 17, there's no more Israel. It's no more northern Israel. It's going to be taken out. And once we get to the end with Hoshea and they're taken out, we're going to kick back to Rehoboam and go through the kings of Judah. But Brother Anthony's been working on a timeline. It's looking good. We're kind of tweaking some stuff on that. And so once we get that together, we'll print off a whole bunch of copies for everybody here to basically have. But I hope that you're memorizing these kings. So obviously Saul, David, and then Solomon, that's easy. But the northern kingdom, you should be remembering that it's Jeroboam, Nadab, Baasha, Elah, Zimri, Omri, Ahab, Ahaziah, Jehoram, and now Jehu. Okay? So, like I said, this is a fun thing to go through with all these kings, go through these stories, but if you get anything out of it, try to memorize these kings in order, because it's always good to have that knowledge as far as who comes after who when you're reading these kings. So, but the same with the word of prayer, Heavenly Father, Lord, we thank you for today. Thank you for the souls that were saved today, but also this past week. And Lord, just pray that you'd be with us as we go throughout the rest of this week with our jobs. And Lord, just help us to know the Bible. And Lord, just everything in the Bible is obviously profitable. I just pray that you'd help us to use it for you and for your glory. And Lord, we love you and pray also in Jesus Christ's name. Amen.